Hi, I'm Lois, real estate specialist with Kootenai Electric Cooperative, and you're listening to Electrification Unplugged.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Electrification Unplugged, Kootenai Electric's podcast where we take a deep dive into all things electricity. I'm Melissa Newcomer, KEC's Manager of Member Experience.
And I'm Reed Christensen, Chief Operations and Financial Officer. Today we're going to explain what demand is and how it relates to peak use charge for residential members.
Yeah, and the reason we're doing that is because, as you may have seen, KEC is proposing to redesign rates that would be effective in January of next year. And the biggest change to this redesign is the introduction of a peak use charge, which is a demand-based rate affecting residential members. So for today's episode, we're going to talk about what demand is and how we as a utility are charged for it, why this charge is necessary, and how members can minimize their costs. So Reed, why don't you start us off by explaining what demand is?
All right, Melissa, picture this. We've got a fictional city, and the city council is planning out the roads for the future.
Okay.
But here's a twist. There's only one car in the whole town, just one.
Wow.
But the car still needs to be able to reach every single home and business, so the roads don't need to be huge, right?
No.
You'd only need to build like a one-lane road, super minimal. And that's kind of how we think about the electric system when we design it for if we had to deliver a tiny amount of electricity to each address. That's the idea behind what we would call like a minimum system. And that's kind of where the service availability charge comes in. It covers just the basic infrastructure, even if usage is low.
You know what that reminds me of actually is our first line that we installed. We had one line that went north and one line that went south and serving 385 members. And that kind of reminds me of your one car lane situation. So,
and they probably just had one light in each house or something.
Exactly. Like it was very, very minimal. So even just with one car, like the city still needs a transportation department, right? Like to build and maintain the roads?
Right. You still need to design them, you build them, plow them in the winter, maintain them, all that. So now let's change the scenario a little bit. So let's say every resident in the city now has a car, and the city council just decides, look, we're done with traffic, no more congestion. We don't care what it takes. So now they have to build roads that are wide enough to handle every car on the road at the same time.
That kind of sounds good in theory, but that sounds like a lot of lanes.
It is, right? And it let's even make it more extreme. So imagine there's a festival, like the city had. Everyone comes to this festival once a month, and everyone's driving at the same time to get there. Now you're talking about roads that could be like 100 lanes wide or bigger, depending on the population. And that's what we call demand in the electric industry. When everyone needs access to the grid at the same time, even if it's just once a year or once a month, the system has to be able to has to be built to handle it.
So what you're saying is it's not just about how much electricity people use, but really like when they use it.
Right. That's exactly right. Let's take it a step further. Imagine you have a 50,000 square foot lake cabin.
Those are my dreams.
When it's occupied, it's using 1,000 kilowatt hours a day, but it's only used in the summer, maybe once a month. Still, the electric system has to be built to handle that kind of load. So you're going to have bigger transformers to serve it. You're going to have bigger, thicker wire because of the higher voltage, sturdier poles that carry that wire, all of it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So even if it's not used that often, like the system still has to be ready for when members want to use it that often and that peak use.
Yep. And that's the difference between kind of a minimum system and which is covered by our service availability charge, and then demand or peak use charge. What we work hard to do in our electric co-op is make sure that the costs tied to those peak demands are paid by the people who are actually causing them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Otherwise, people with lower use could end up paying more than their fair share, and those with higher use are doing the opposite.
Right. So let's go back to our traffic example. So you've got one car, and let's just pretend I have 100 teenagers. I have 4, but let's just do 100. So they're all driving around during the festival. If we're both paying the same rate based only on usage, you're basically subsidizing the costs of the roads for me. And that's why rate structures need to reflect not just what people are using, but how and when they're using it, because that's where the biggest chunk of costs come from.
I've got one teenager, and 100 is like, that's
Oh, don't even.
a lot.
Let's not go there.
But that's a really good analogy and a good visual for our listeners. And, sometimes it's difficult to visualize a lot of people using electricity because you can't really see electricity. So this is really helpful. So this rate redesign helps reduce these rate class subsidies, and it provides members with more opportunities to control their electric bills should they choose to do so.
That's right. It also more closely aligns members' bills with how the cooperative is billed.
Yeah, that's really important. So now that we hopefully have a better understanding of what demand or peak use is, let's talk about how members on the residential and general service rate schedules will be billed for it under the proposed redesign.
Yeah, sounds good.
So utilities have a couple of options to bill for demand. For example, all KEC commercial members are billed for their peak demand during a 15-minute interval, which means that we are identifying and measuring the most amount of power that was used over 15 minutes during any time in the billing period. And then we're using that value to calculate the demand charged. Now, the proposed peak use charge, which again only affects residential and general service members, will instead look at the total amount of power being consumed during that hour. But instead of looking at all of the hours during the day, we're going to narrow our focus and only look at our peak hours, which typically fall between 6 and 10 in the morning and 5 and 9 in the evening.
Okay, so 6 and 10 in the morning, 5 and 9 in the evening. So we need a mnemonic device. So let's go,
Okay.
how about from 6 to 10, limit your power. From 5 to 9, it's again peak hour.
Yes, I love
There we
that.
go.
We'll put it on a magnet.
Yeah.
So one way to look at this is to imagine a row of 24 buckets, each representing an hour in the day. Now, imagine that as water is added to each bucket, that represents the amount of energy used during that hour. So over a period of 24 hours, the total amount of water in all of those buckets represents the total amount of power that you used during that time. And that amount is then billed using the kilowatt hour charge line item on the bill. You with me so far on how that works?
I think so. 24 hours, 24 buckets.
Yep.
And it's being filled up with kilowatts.
There you go.
Basically.
Okay.
Mhm.
So we've got these 24 buckets lined up, one for each hour of the day. And if you think about that on a larger scale, say like someone's billing period, which is typically 30 days, that's significantly more buckets. But it's still the same concept. 1 hour, one bucket for 1 hour.
Right. So like 720 hours in a month. So 720 buckets.
There you
basically.
go. Yep.
Mhm.
But in order to determine the peak use charge, we are only going to look at the buckets during our peak hours.
Which, according to my little mnemonic, it was 6 to 10 and 5 to 9, right?
Yes. So we narrow down the focus to only those buckets. And then out of the buckets used during those hours, we find the one with the most amount of water or power in it. And that's what a member's peak use is. And that amount of power is measured in kilowatts.
It sounds pretty simple. I like the analogy.
Mm-hmm.
It's also a little complicated. I'm not gonna lie, but I do understand what you're saying. The buckets does paint a picture for me.
That's good. So I should also mention that under the proposed rate redesign, members on the residential rate schedules will get the first 5 kilowatts or kW at no cost. So that'll be helpful. And in fact, members on our prepaid rate will not have a peak use charge at all.
That's a great explanation, Melissa. I think we've thrown some different analogies out there, but our hope is that members find them useful. It can be really difficult imagining things that you can't see, and I think this is one of those situations.
That's right. And while we are on the topic of rates, I think we should point out a few pieces of information specific to this proposed rate redesign.
Yeah, good idea. It's important to understand that the proposed rate design is revenue neutral. That means that overall, KEC will not be collecting any additional revenue as a result of these proposed changes. But it does mean that there will be members who experience an increase and those who experience a decrease, so that we limit different members subsidizing the cost for other members. So what we're really trying to do is collect revenues to better recover the particular costs associated with certain member classes, like a residential customer or a commercial customer.
Right. So essentially making sure that each rate class pays their fair share.
Right.
All right. So thanks for that good distinction, Reed. So under the proposed changes, about 70% of residential members are actually expected to have either no change to the cost they pay or may experience decrease if they are using their power in a consistent method with how they have in the past. The remaining 30% of members, however, could potentially pay more if they don't make any changes to their behavior in terms of how they use power in their home.
That's right. So for members who use multiple appliances at one time during those peak hours, which includes maybe charging an electric vehicle, are putting a larger strain on the electric grid.
So it's like similar to all those teenagers in their cars on the road at the same time, right?
Exactly. During that time, we are charged more by our power supplier, and that cost is currently subsidized by all members. So through the proposed rate design, that cost will be attributed to those who impose it.
Okay, so not only is it just about the additional demand costs we're charged by our power supplier, but it seems like we also have to design and build our power grid so that it can accommodate the amount of power that all members are using at the same time. And without that capacity, members could experience blackouts or brownouts, or, going back to your analogy, total gridlock, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's incredibly difficult to design a rate to have a minimal impact on everyone. So the approach we've taken is to redesign and the residential rates so they more closely align with the way we are billed from our power supplier, the Bonneville Power Administration, as well as how we build the infrastructure of our system along the lines of that earlier fictitious city analogy that I mentioned earlier.
So, as we mentioned at the beginning of this episode, the proposed rate redesign will likely go into effect with the January 2026 billings. So, Reed, let's talk about what members can do between now and then to better understand how these changes may affect them and maybe how they can better control their costs.
Sure. So one thing members can do is work on being mindful on how much power members are using during our peak hours from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. and from 5 to 9 p.m. So ask yourself, can I heat or cool my house before or after this time? Do I need to do laundry or run the dishwasher during this time or at the same time? Some things might be more difficult to change, like when you run your oven while cooking dinner or when people take showers. But the key is to minimize stacking these events during the same time and delay what you can until outside of the peak hours.
Yeah, I feel like that's a really good tangible tip. And I'm, just thinking about my situation. And I have 2 kids. And while I may not be able to get them to take their showers outside of peak hours because their bedtimes with school and everything, we could change behaviors so that, we only have one kid showering at a time, and maybe we don't do that while the oven is on and while we're drying clothes at the same time. So just trying to spread those things out where you can. And Reed, you have an EV charger at your house, right? So can you program your EV charger to run outside those peak hours?
You can, yes. There's an app that I can use, but honestly, I'm very guilty, and maybe it's because of the way the rates are designed. But I'll plug it in when I get home from work. But I can easily change that now.
Yeah, these are just behavior changes that we're all capable of making should we choose to prioritize that. Well, we're also working on some other resources to help members understand how they are using their power. And we're working on some enhancements to our Smart Hub platform, which is the app and website where members can manage their account. And those enhancements will allow members to see some appliance level data of their power consumption. We are expecting to roll it out this fall, and we're really excited to see how it's able to help the members.
It might also be helpful to remind members that we have an energy conservation program where we are able to offer members rebates on certain energy efficiency upgrades. So make sure you take a look at our website at www.kec.com for that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And speaking of our website, we are working on a web page specific to the rate design, and we will be continue to add information like laying out exactly what the proposed rate design looks like. We'll continue to add frequently asked questions. There's information on there like how to submit written comments to the board about the proposed rate design and information on the workshops that we will be hosting this summer. And these workshops are where members have the option to participate in either an in-person workshop or a virtual workshop. And it's essentially a meeting to where you can learn more about the proposed rate design and have a chance to ask questions.
Yeah, definitely check out the website to learn more.
Yeah, lots of information on there. Well, I kind of think we've talked enough about demand and how we're proposing to change our rates, don't you think?
I think so, Melissa.
But it's been another good episode. So until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay plugged into the amazing world of electricity.